we're going to talk about the Labour Party. Literally, the trauma of having to talk about Labour politics has taken its toll. Just just even mentioning it makes me shudder slightly. But we've got to talk about it, so might as well just embrace it. Now, in the leadership contest, Keir Starmer said, well, he said a lot of things, and obviously the reality of what he's actually done are well, on completely different planets. But one of the things he promised was that there'd be an end to the leadership imposing candidates in selections, all selections for parliamentary candidates, including by-elections, and members, local members, would be able to choose freely their own candidate, which is, I think, pretty reasonable. I think everyone was kind of happy with that as a commitment. It hasn't happened, to say the least. Now, there's a by-election coming up in Wakefield, which is a constituency in Yorkshire, after the Tory MP was convicted of essentially a sex crime linked to children, and that's now triggered a by-election. Now, Labour is obviously in the process of selecting its candidate, but it's been completely and utterly fixed. Members aren't able to select their own candidates. The local candidates have been excluded from the shortlist, so members don't get the right to choose who their candidate will be based on the full range of people who are standing, to ensure that the leadership's favourite candidate will win instead. Now, that's caused huge outrage amongst local party members. The entire executive committee of the Wakefield constituency Labour Party has resigned. Now, let's talk to Andrew Dolan, who is from Momentum, the grassroots. I think you could call it the organised Labour left, Momentum. I'm sure you'll all be familiar with it.
I am.
Hey, Andrew, how you doing?
Yeah, good. How are you?
Very good. Just talk us through it. I mean, I just gave a quick summary there, but I mean, just how fixed is this? I mean, just from one to fixed.
Well, it's not quite as bad as the famous shortlist of one up in Hartlepool, but what you did have was, a number of strong local candidates from the sort of soft left through to the centre who were blocked first from the long list and now the shortlist. There's a shortlist of just 2 candidates that have gone to the hustings today, which are taking place up in Wakefield. Mm-hmm. So, in reality, it goes exactly against what Keir Starmer promised in his leadership election, as you talked about, and that's local parties choosing candidates, local candidates who know the area, and also a rule change that conference passed last year. Now, it's worth noting that rule change, in the event of snap elections, would ensure that any panel that decides on the shortlist would have a majority of CLP members on that panel, and also a couple of members from the NEC as well. Now, that was the first breach of the rule, when the leadership decided to put together a panel with an NEC majority and ask only one member of the CLP to attend that panel. And then a breach of the principle in not allowing a good and wide selection of local candidates to get through to the hustings today, which is what the local party are quite rightly so outraged about. And what's important to remember on this really isn't a left-right thing. If you look at the CLP section in conference last year, over 60% of CLP delegates voted in favour of this rule change, which we were supporting, but it went well beyond your sort of core left vote, which was around about 50% in the CLP delegate section in most of the votes. So you can see this really reaches across a sort of broad stretch of the party's political wings and has kind of united quite a lot of people in anger. You've even got usually quite sort of middle of the road NEC members like Anne Black who've come out and criticised this, and the fact they've ignored it now on 3 occasions. And obviously, as you pointed out, it just feeds into that narrative that Labour is led by someone who's extremely dishonest and has an extreme nervousness with party democracy.
Now, hustings are currently taking place, and we kind of see how that'll develop. I mean, obviously, most people won't be watching this live, but it finishes at 2:30 today, the 12 till 2:30. So they're currently taking place. I mean, how do you see this playing out? Because obviously, the leadership. I mean, it's interesting, actually. If this had happened, I mean, I know this has become a well-worn thing to say, but obviously, if something like this had happened under Jeremy Corbyn, we'd never hear the end of it. But actually, it has got some substantial media coverage because it's just so flagrant. So I mean, the leadership are just going to ride it out, aren't they? That's their plan.
They'll try to. I mean, hustings now, wouldn't be surprised if you start to hear reports of things coming out of that hustings that it got tense. Elliot Chappell on Labour List has just reported now that one of the bloc candidates is potentially threatening a legal challenge at how the process has been handled. But they may get away with it in this instance, but I think the kind of knock-on effect it has in these local parties, and Wakefield's quite a vibrant local party, will be that these people simply won't come out on the doorstep. Now, this was something we found across the locals across the country, and as we know, Labour in England especially did very, very bad. And one of the major reasons there is that councillors just couldn't get canvassers out on the doorstep. You had many, many instances of councillors being the only people doing their own canvassing. Now, we did our best at Momentum to mobilise people to key councils down in Worthing, Southwark, up in North Ayrshire, trying to put our organisational weight behind fantastic candidates doing fantastic things. But the apathy that's been created by the leadership's distrust of local people and local parties goes well beyond the left, and I think will have a knock-on effect. And what you've got to remember with a seat like Wakefield, now that whole area has a bit of a history for candidates being parachuted in under the Blair years. You had Mary Cray in Wakefield up until 2019. You've got Yvette Cooper not far away in Normanton and Pontefract. You had Ed Bowles, Ed Miliband, who's a little bit politically different, but the principle still stands. And even though someone like Mary Cray was a victim ultimately of the Brexit divide and how that carved apart Labour's base, there is a real sense of like anti-establishment feeling in an area like Wakefield, and parachuting these candidates in will not go well with the electorate. People like Mary Cray were never really that well liked in the constituency, precisely because they had no organic roots in it. And Labour here, I think, is just replicating a problem. We're starting to see early signs of this, and if it continues, that will in the long term come back to bite it. Because it was a major problem under New Labour in terms of its legacy, that the whole generation of MPs who were completely talentless, promoted on the basis of loyalty or part of a clique. And in places like Scotland, that wreaked havoc on Labour's electoral chances. What you've got to remember, these candidates that are getting blocked, one of them went on Labour's own future candidates programme. These aren't hard left candidates. Good example is Jack Hemingway, who's a well-respected deputy leader of Wakefield Council, who you'd broadly say is on the soft left. The fact that someone like him's been excluded tells you this is well beyond left and right. It's about a clique close to people around Starmer who want to reshape the party in the image of New Labour, regardless of what electoral damage that does. And I think you'll see a bit of backlash in the party after today, and you'll see a bit of backlash in the constituency.
I mean, it's interesting because Hartlepool is what I'm going to refer to as a comparison. But in terms of Wakefield, this should be in the bag for the Labour Party, not least because of the circumstances in which the Conservative MP stood down. But we saw in Hartlepool where you got, in that case, it was just ludicrous. You got one. I mean, I did a video about it and including an interview with the candidate, which was pretty cringe. I think everyone who's watched the interview would agree.
I remember it,
I felt sorry for him in the end, to be honest. I mean, that the issue is, I mean, the odds are still Labour would win Hartlepool just because, not Hartlepool, we've done Hartlepool. We'll win in Wakefield, unlike in Hartlepool, where Labour threw it away. But it will, I mean, it is self-inflicted damage, isn't it? Because, as you say, getting people to knock, and if they're demoralised, and also people in the community will not look upon this kindly, regardless actually where they stand politically.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, we did talk under the last 5-6 years about the importance of like your ground game. This is something we saw, in Obama in the mid 2000s. We learned some of those lessons in the UK. We applied it under Jeremy. Now, the leadership probably think they can win elections by effectively going around the activist space and appealing to the media. But I think, or I would hope, they got a nasty shock when they realised how willing the right-wing press is to go after Starmer, despite the kind of gestures that he's made around crime, policing, immigration. They've absolutely hammered him over the last couple of weeks. And I think, that's shown how willing they are to go after him despite his right-wing drift. Now, when you're faced with that blockage, you've got to find a way around it. And having a ground game is one way of trying to do that. Getting boots on the ground, persuasive conversations, canvassing, trying to turn out your vote. And quite frankly, through self-inflicted episodes like this, they will not be able to turn people out. And again, we're not just talking about the left wing here. There's a lot of people in the party who aren't particularly that happy with the direction Starmer's going. But as long as they're able to campaign for good candidates, focus on local issues, do good campaigns, they will turn out and they will run really vibrant CLPs like you have in Broxtowe. That's an example people often point to in terms of pioneering community organising on the ground through the Labour Party. But it is absolutely self-inflicted. And yes, the kind of structural conditions are in favour of this being a Labour win. The collapse of the Brexit Party vote, which was a big factor in Wakefield, the government's unpopularity, and the broader trend of quite a few of those sort of Labour to Tory switches or Labour to Brexit Party switches kind of heading back a little bit in Labour's direction. But the long-term damage of this goes back to what we're saying about the impact of kind of nodding dog candidates up in Scotland, will be that the party will become hollowed out. And there's a famous Irish social scientist, Peter Meyer, who talks a lot about the hollowing out social democratic parties. We saw the collapse of the Parti Socialiste in France and in other parts of Europe too, Greece especially. Now, under Corbyn, we did see a bit of a reversal of that trend, both in terms of membership, finances, and also vote share. But it seems like the party leadership right now are intent on getting back on that road to ruin and driving the party into the ground, because, ultimately, the trends aren't there for Labour to come anywhere near close to winning a general election. And these sorts of stitch-ups that alienate local voters and local parties will only accelerate that trend.
Just finally, David Barter asked, Labour's currently in the grips of Mandelson's authoritarian sock puppet. What can be done to combat this, and why aren't MPs and unions speaking out about this?
Yeah. Well, look, I'll speak not for MPs, but I'll speak on behalf of the organisation that I work for, Momentum. Now, we had a really good set of local elections. We reckon we had 100 new socialists, that's Momentum members or allies and supporters, elected into office for the first time. That follows on from programs that we have, our Future Candidates program, Future Councillors program, where we develop these people, give them the skills to navigate tricky selection processes, help them campaign. We'll now funnel those people into a councillor network to focus on community wealth building, which we have about 300 members. Now, the reality is, because the kind of proclivity of the leadership to suspend, to block, to undermine left candidates, we've had to take a bit of a different strategic approach. So you're not seeing the big headlines about open selections and different candidates. We're working much more under the radar. Now, sometimes that means that people think as an organisation, as the left, we're not quote unquote fighting back, but we're organising on the ground. And these locals, I think, really justified our strategic approach. So our long-term approach in the next couple of years is to repeat that at the local level, make sure we get good socialists into office that want to pursue things like community wealth building. And we're looking at around, a selection of seats across the country where we're working closely, we're offering advice, we're working with left networks to put in place the different building blocks we need to get these people selected. Now, look, it may well be that the leadership pursue a scorched earth approach in blocking every candidate getting through into Parliament. But usually the biggest blockage to a leadership doing that is resource limitations, just simply not being able to be over all seats. And you even saw that under Blair Lears. Quite a few decent candidates in the long term got through. So we're focusing on candidate selections and base building. Now, sometimes that means we're not always shouting at Starmer or trying to get rid of him, as some of our base would like us to do. But we think this is a period of kind of recalibration, rebuilding for the left. And that's where our strategy is. And I think it paid dividends at the locals. Now, the reality is Starmer's going to be the Labour leader into the next election. We're going to do our best to try and shape the party in the direction we would like to see it in terms of policy and candidates. But, let's see what happens after 2024, because opportunities will open up, I think, at the national level again.
Andrew, really, really appreciate that. I think that really
No
sets
problem.
out very clearly what's happening, obviously, in Wakefield, but also the broader context within the Labour Party. But as I said, talking about the Labour Party is an emotionally exhausting process, but we've got to do it.
well, it is, Owen, but look, you in the Labour left pre-2015, and as difficult as things are, the institutional strength we have, new organisations like Momentum, like Tribune, like TWT, podcasts like this that aren't mediated by the mainstream media, we've got a reach and we've got a base that we didn't have then, and that's a huge foundation to build upon.
Yeah, and I remember, but before 2015, I think it's really important, despite all the defeats and so on we faced, things have changed very substantially, and particularly amongst younger people. There's far more of a kind of natural sympathy for the ideas of the left. That wasn't necessarily the case before. Andrew, really, really appreciate it. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Owen. No problem.